Now, in presenting a summary of the life of this great man, I really had problems. I wanted to kind of brief it down and distill it. More than that, I wanted to do what Andy Allison did in the book. I wanted to bring you not just the life of Jefferson, but the spirit of Jefferson. He captures that in the book so beautifully with stories and illustrations, etc. So I have 15 pages of notes. And I hope, because I have timekeepers around me, they will keep me going so I can get through the material, because here was an exciting life, one of the foremost human beings that's ever graced the planet Earth. And I'm sure he had no idea as he launched his life how differently it would turn out than he had anticipated. And maybe that's true of all of us, isn't it? Now, in order to get him in his proper location, I just want to have you place in your mind old Jamestown on the James River, where John Smith and Pocahontas and all of them had their problems and trials. Now you just go up the James River and you'll come to Williamsburg. And if you go up about 50 miles more, you'll come to Richmond. Williamsburg used to be the old capital. Richmond was then made the capital and is today. Now keep going up the James River. We're headed west. Keep going west, further and further west, until you get to what used to be the frontier of Virginia. And as you get into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, you're in Albemarle County. And that's the birthplace and the lifetime home of Thomas Jefferson. He was born in Shadwell on the 13th of February, 1743. And Shadwell is not very far from Charlottesville. They're both located on the Rivanna River, which flows into the James River. Remember, now we're out on the frontier of Virginia. When Jefferson was born, George Washington, living about 100 miles away, was already 11 years old. Patrick Henry, who lived some 100 miles in the eastern direction, was 7 years old. John Adams up in Massachusetts was 8 years old. Samuel Adams, whose signature appears in this book we received tonight, was now 21 and had just received his master's degree from Harvard University. He had already decided that he would not be wealthy, as his father had been before him. He would devote his whole life to the divine science of good government for human happiness. He considered politics to be a divine science if administered as it properly should be. James Madison wouldn't be born for another 8 years, and Alexander Hamilton wouldn't be born for 14 more years. So that's the setting as the Creator was beginning to spill out onto the earth the great patriot personalities that would be responsible for creating the first free people in modern times. Each one of them has a thrilling biography in his own account, and tonight we're just going to go very briefly through that of Thomas Jefferson. First of all, it's a great blessing to be well born, and Thomas Jefferson was. His father was a big man, a huge man, and you can imagine a little fellow like Thomas Jefferson being able to honestly boast that his father was probably the strongest man in the whole state of Virginia, certainly in Albemarle County. He was so big and so strong that he could lift 2 hogsheads of tobacco, each weighing 500 pounds, and lift them up on end simultaneously. He was lieutenant colonel of the militia. He was justice of the peace. He was a member of the House of Burgesses, which was the state legislature, which became the state legislature. He had not had a lot of formal education, but you wouldn't have known it. He was sort of like my own father. He did it by self-study. He was an avid reader, and he was an excellent horseman. All these characteristics Thomas Jefferson absorbed from his father as long as they were together, which was only 14 years. Now, his mother came from one of the most illustrious families of Virginia. Her name was Jane Randolph. And for those days, she was a well-educated woman with a very strong personality and good judgment. And later on, Jefferson noticed that when he went to Williamsburg, doors would open to him And society would welcome him as he would hear people say, his mother is a Randolph. It does make a difference sometimes. Anyway, Jefferson knew that he had been blessed with very fine parents. His father wanted him to get a good education, so he started him out at 5. And Jefferson was bored to death with rote learning. And so he excused himself for reasons that I can suspect. But anyway, he got out of the class long enough to get down around behind the building. And he got down on his knees and he said the Lord's Prayer, and then asked the Lord to please get him out of this predicament. He hoped to get out of this awful, awful school. Well, he was later sent at the age of 9 to William Douglas, who really knew how to teach children. Probably the Carden method, Don. But in any event, this is what he studied. During 5 years, among other things, he studied language. And at the end of 5 years, he could read Latin, Greek, French. And a little later on, he learned Spanish, Italian, Anglo-Saxon, and after a few more years, he could articulate and communicate in several of those languages. And he worked awfully hard. I mean, it didn't come easy to him. And I only studied 2 of those languages in addition to English, and they were tough. But anyway, he worked hard and he did it. Now, his father died when he was 14 years of age. His father was 49, Jefferson was 14. And that meant that Thomas Jefferson had inherited the whole estate, but he was here just a 14-year-old boy, head of a family. His mother, in 15 years, had 10 children. And Jefferson was the oldest boy, but the third child, having 2 older sisters. But now, under the law of those days, he'd inherited the whole estate, which was temporarily put under a guardian, and they shot him off to William and Mary's College. And he was so proficient in his learning that when they interviewed him and talked to him, they entered him at 16 in William and Mary's College as an advanced student. Now, by this time, he'd almost gained his full height. He's a big man. He's 6'2" and 1/2 inches. He is at least a half a foot taller than everybody else on the average that's running around Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia in those days. He is described as bright, of cheerful countenance, with freckles, sandy reddish hair, as you'll see in the picture on the book, a lithe, muscular body, large, sturdy hands. Now, he entered into the excitement of the Temple of Williamsburg, which was new to him. I mean, he was not a society boy. He was used to hunting and shooting and study and so forth in the country. He would spend sometimes 15 hours a day in study. This man was a natural, instinctive student. And in spite of that, he loved dances. He went to the Apollo Room at the Raleigh Tavern to attend concerts and stage plays. Being a crack shot, he engaged in lots of gun contests and often won the prize. And occasionally, when he was able to, he would go on fox hunts. It was all a very exciting life. But those who were with him at the time said that no matter how entertaining the company was, when it came time for the books, he'd tear himself away. Didn't have TV, you see, that would have been the acid test. But anyway, in another company, he could tear himself away and hit those books. I'll tell you, many a time I've dragged my feet downstairs to my little salt mine because I knew it was time to write. Beautiful company upstairs and so forth, but that can go on forever because there's so many beautiful friends to visit with. Meanwhile, the books do not get written if you don't tear yourself loose from the more pleasant things and go to the salt mine. At this time, he came under the direction of 3 prominent men, and I want to emphasize this because later on he said, I had a lot of temptations. Many of those with whom I was associated became useless human beings. Useless human beings. They'd never amounted to anything because of the temptations that we all had at that time. But I had 3 great men who, even though I was a teenager, made me a personal friend and took me into their confidence. I'll mention their names very briefly. I could give a biography of each one of them. They were so great in their own right. One of them was William Small, who introduced Jefferson to science and mathematics. And Jefferson became outstanding in both of these fields. Then there was Professor George Wythe. It's spelled W-Y-T-H-E, and most people say Wythe, but it's actually Wythe. And he was the first professional law professor who occupied a chair at a university in the United States, and the second one in the British Empire. And Thomas Jefferson had the benefit of his company, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Then there was Governor Fauquier, I guess it is, who was the royal governor. And when he found out that Jefferson could play the violin beautifully, he would invite him over to the royal palace in Williamsburg, which was the governor's royal palace, and they would play duets together. And he introduced Jefferson to the highest level of refinement and society in Williamsburg. This was a great experience for this young fellow. And in his writings, Jefferson said, as I had temptations, I would say to myself, if I did what these fellows are doing, what would these three men think of me? So I didn't do it. And it really changed the direction of my life away from many of my companions. Now, about the age of 19, he fell in love, deeply in love. And her name was Rebecca Burwell. And he liked to call her by a love name, Belinda. He wouldn't tell her, but he'd write all kinds of notes and diaries. Oh, my beloved Belinda, my beautiful Belinda. Well, finally, he decided maybe he could venture a proposal. Would it be possible that they might do something together, exciting and beautiful? And so he proposed to her, and he said it was so awful. It was so terrible. He said she was embarrassed for me. But I had the speech made up. He said I just didn't do it very well. And so he said finally she just kind of walked away. So he said, I don't think I made much of an impression on her. So he memorized it better the next time. And the next time he came to her, he told her, he said, now, I just want to make a speech, please. So he made his proposal speech. And she tried to keep from laughing, but not out loud. But anyway, she just patted him on the back and sent him on his way. 3 weeks later, she announced her engagement to his best friend. And the best friend did not know that Thomas Jefferson loved this girl. And so he asked Tom to be his best man. that was a real trial and tribulation. He didn't have the courage to propose to another girl till he was 28, about 9 years after that. Now, as soon as he got out of William and Mary College, he was pulled under the wing of George Wythe. George Wythe was a remarkable person. He gathered around him the most outstanding young men who seemed to have an aptitude for public service. And he put them in his own little private school where he would train them to be great patriots for freedom. And Thomas Jefferson was one of his first students. Afterwards, he also trained John Marshall and James Monroe, and Henry Clay. Just a man who wanted to gather people around him who had great promise. Up in Massachusetts, Sam Adams was doing the very first thing. And if I went down through the list of patriots that were trained by Sam Adams and George Wythe, you'd have the core of the founding fathers practically, at least the ones that made the major contribution to the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself. Now, while he was studying with George Wythe, I want you to just see what kind of an education this young man got by being prodded by George Wythe. George Wythe would say, here's a fine book. I want you to read it, and I'll ask you all about it in 2 days. And as a result, look what Thomas Jefferson became expert in for those times. He already had languages, and that was improved. He went into physics, agriculture, mathematics, philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, zoology, botany, religion, politics, history, literature, and rhetoric. He says, these were the days when I was bold in the pursuit of knowledge. That just thrills me. I look at some of our young people today, and they're bored with school. They don't have George Wythe to prod them. And I hand him a book and say, I want to know all about this in a couple of days. You can read it. And that was before speed reading was invented. Anyway, this man became very expert and careful in his knowledge, which extended over a very broad field. Unfortunately, this great person, George Wythe, was murdered by one of his own relatives. George Wythe had done very well in the law practice and accumulated a small fortune. This relative poisoned him, hoping that it wouldn't be found out and he would get an early inheritance. That's kind of tragic. Now, at about this point in the life of Jefferson, he wonders which way he's going to go. He's a natural student. He turns out to be a family man of the highest order, a very efficient operator of not only one plantation, but as it turned out, thousands of acres that he later inherited or obtained through the inheritance of his wife. I mean, that would have been the ideal life for Thomas Jefferson and probably the direction he would have gone. And then something happened that changed his life. About that time, the Stamp Act had been passed. And he heard down there in Williamsburg that a fellow that he knew that was about 7 years older than he, named Patrick Henry, was going to give a speech in the debates over at the House of Burgesses, the state legislature, as we would call it. So he said, I went over to hear him, and he said, as he mounted his voice and his talents in protest against the violation of the natural rights of the colonists by a parliament that had no authority whatever over these colonies, and then did it in the name of the king because he did have authority, he said, I was stirred. And see if I attended the debate, he said, I stood at the door of the lobby of the House of Burgesses. I heard the splendid display of Mr. Henry's talents. They were great indeed, such as I have never heard from any man. And as Patrick Henry got higher and higher in the momentum of his presentation, there were those in the crowd who began to say, treason, treason. And Patrick Henry stopped and said, if this be treason, make the most of it, which was an invitation to have himself hanged and quartered if they could prove it was treason. And Jefferson said, a flame was lighted in my soul that remained the illumination of my entire life. I was never the same. I knew that I would be involved in public life, not in the quiet homestead life that I was planning for myself. He said, this was probably the most important single day in my whole life. And that was May the 29th, 1765. Now, he'd never been out of the state or the colony of Virginia, and so while he was preparing for his bar examination, he took a little trip. He went up to New York, went to Philadelphia. It was a great experience. You can just feel the thrill of a young traveler as he describes it. And then he came back to take his bar exam. The judges couldn't believe what they were hearing. Not in any of their careers had they heard any young bar applicant give such profound dissertations on every aspect of the law, both ancient and modern. He not only passed the bar, but from then on, any time he made a plea in court, it was received with the greatest of respect. He knew more than his judges did, and more than his teachers did, and much of it through self-study. Now he went back to Shadwell in Albemarle County, up in the foothills near the Blue Ridge Mountains on the frontier to practice law, and was an immediate success. When somebody asked him afterwards why he always won his cases, he said, because I always choose the right side. And there's a lot of merit to that, because I have seen some people of my profession who will make their voice and their talents available for whoever has the most money, whether it's the right side or not. Now Jefferson, he would carefully listen to a client, and then he would say, well, that's your side of the story. Now what would the other fellow be likely to tell me? Oh, a bunch of lies. Do you want me to go over and talk to him? You can if you want to. And Jefferson would. And then he'd decide which one was right. And then he'd go and present it to the court. That's a good way to win cases. You can get a good record that way. Now, At the age of 25, he was elected to the House of Burgesses, which was the state legislature I've mentioned. And he was disgusted when he got there with the language that they used in the bills. He said, why don't we make it simple? Why do we follow England? We don't need all these whereases and wherefores and so forth. He said, I want any bill that I introduce so simple that any of my servants can understand it who are able to read and write. We still haven't learned that lesson, have we? All right, then while he was away, their big home burned down at Shadwell. And he said, I've been wanting to build a house for a long time, a very special house, and so he started to build it. He isn't married, you see, just single, but like to have a nice house. And so he built it on top of a mountain. The first house in America built on top of a mountain. Everybody knew that was stupid. I mean, you got to climb a hill to get home. You have your house down near the river where it can flood out every year. Anyway, he built it on top of the mountain and he called it Monticello, which means little mountain. And he paid a man a certain amount to level off the top of the mountain so he could build his house there. He spent his whole life building it. It was his hobby. He'd build it, then he'd tear it part down. He'd rebuild that. That's nice. I'll build the other side the same way. He'd build that. No, I don't like either one of them. He'd tear both of them down, start over again. No, I think I ought to have a tower. No, I don't like that. I'll put a dome on. And so he just had more fun changing that house around, and it was just full of gadgets, dumbwaiters and hidden closets and so forth. And he had his bed between two rooms, so if anybody snuck up on him in one room, he could escape on the other. Anyway, he was just having all kinds of fun building this house all these years. However, he finally met a girl that he really liked. In fact, a lot of people liked her. She was not yet 20 and already a widow. And her husband had died. They'd married quite early. Very beautiful girl from a very well-to-do family, lived down near Williamsburg. And her name was Martha Wales Skelton. And he asked if he could come over to her house and she'd accompany him on the harpsichord. And would she help him out to that extent while he played the violin, you know. Well, that was a sneaky way to do it because they began making beautiful music together. Pretty soon they decided to make it permanent. And so they were married on New Year's Day in 1772. And they headed out for their honeymoon to get up to Monticello, and they only had one little room. It's still standing. It's a nice little brick house, single little room. And they ran into a terrible blizzard, 2 feet of snow, and they had to unhitch the horses and climb aboard the horses to go the last 8 miles to get to their little honeymoon cottage, which I think he later used as his office. In any event, it's still there. It was the only part of the building that was finished, and that's how they started out their married life. Their first little girl was born toward the end of that year. Now, Jefferson's father-in-law died, and his wife inherited thousands of acres, much of it west of where the Jefferson estate was, and it included the famous natural bridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is now world famous. And Jefferson used to often ride horseback with his wife out to the natural bridge and just spend the whole day or a weekend enjoying that beautiful sight. Now, as I mentioned, the County of Albemarle had elected him to the House of Burgesses in 1769. So we're getting into the tension period with England now, and he served there until 1775, and all that time he said, we don't know what we're doing. So he started studying all the classics. And you'll find in his notes now references to Cicero, John Locke, Montesquieu, Lord Kames, Bolingbroke, Blackstone, and so forth. And he says it was during this period that I began to realize that there was a way to govern people so they could be free, happy, and prosperous. Then they found that things were getting so bad that they were going to have to deal with King George more directly. What had really occurred was that the administration of King George was determined they were going to get these American colonies to pay taxes. And they first had the Stamp Act, and that had to be repealed, and the Townshend Act, and that had to be repealed. Finally, they had a great idea. They have warehouses full of tea, and Americans won't buy them. Not just because they have a tax on them, but because they're more expensive than Dutch tea. The law said that if you buy Dutch tea, you got to pay a tax in gold to England. But why fool around with that? Just buy a little on the side, you know. under the table. So there's all kinds of smuggling going on. And so it was thought that they'd be very clever if what they would do would be to eliminate the British middleman, pull the price way down with a tax attached, send it over to America. The Americans would buy it. We'd have their precedent that they had allowed their goods to be taxed. Then they couldn't complain about it anymore. The Americans learned about it, saw through the plot, forced all of the ships to turn around and go back, except in Boston. And the governor said, I will not allow those boats to return until they're unloaded. And Sam Adams and the boys along the harbor said, and they will not be unloaded. They will not be allowed to be unloaded. And so the governor said, then they'll just sit there. The law said that if they sat there for 20 days, the governor could then confiscate the cargo and just sell it to the lowest bidder. And there's always a lowest bidder that will take it when it's a good price. Sam Adams saw exactly what the strategy was, and he pleaded to the governor, don't do this. Don't force us to take direct action. And on the 19th day, great crowd assembled at the Old South Church. A final plea was made to the governor. He was adamant, and so Sam Adams said, we have no alternative but to take direct action. Now, the Boston Tea Party was quite different than I thought that it was. They went over along the wharf, boarded the ship. Some were painted like Indians, some with black faces so they wouldn't be recognized. The British guards gave them no trouble. They went aboard, dumped all the tea overboard. It was very quiet. There was no hullabaloo. Like I thought, it'd be a big party. It wasn't, because all those people knew they were going to have to pay for that tea. And it says they were throwing down the gauntlet to King George, so they all sat there very solemn. The only sound was the tea being poured out into the harbor. Killed all the fish, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, when King George heard about that, he came down with full hammer on Massachusetts. He put Boston under martial law. He appointed the head of the British troops of America to be the new governor of Massachusetts. And for all intents and purposes, he put an embargo on all trade going into Boston. And he threatened any of these rebels who rose up to be transported to England for trial. 500-pound reward was put on the head of John Hancock and Sam Adams. They could be taken dead or alive. I mean, things right away got tough. The population of Boston went down from 16,000 to 7,000 almost overnight as the British troops moved in. Well, all the colonies were horrified. And so they decided maybe we all ought to get together in a conference. And that was Jefferson that in Virginia instigated the idea of having a continental conference, perhaps at Philadelphia. And that's what they did. And that was called the First Continental Congress. And you know what they did? They said, King George, we're sorry about that. We'll pay for the tea. We just trying to show you that we don't want to be taxed without representation. We've said it over and over, but that's our message, please. Now we'll pay for the tea. Let's be all good friends again. It was a very humble petition put out by the First Continental Congress, and they adjourned, thought the king would read it, forgive them, tell them how much the tea cost, and they'd pay it, and they'd go back to the plow. Do you know what King George did? I will not read it, he said. I do not read petitions from traitors and rebels. Threw it in the fire. Boy, when the colonists heard about that, were they upset and angry? And so even John Dickens and some of the pacifists said, well, now he's declaring war. And by December, that's exactly what he did. And he said, anybody who wants to capture an American ship can have the cargo, and the sailors will be impressed into the British Navy. And so that began to happen. I'll tell you, things were really beginning to boil by this time. And so in the spring, Jefferson was one of those sent to the Second Continental Congress that he had helped instigate. Now, he wrote a letter to King George. It's so interesting. It's a summary view of the rights of British America. And he gave it to the Virginia legislature, and he said, no, let's pass that and send it over in the name of all of us. And they read it. Oh, it was Patrick Henry X squared. And so they said, no, we couldn't quite do that. But we will publish it over your name. Well, he said, so be it. Now he has the spirit of Patrick Henry now. Jefferson is putting his life on the line. He's putting his property on the line. He's putting everything he owns on the line. He said, no person is worthy of freedom who will not consider his life worthy of sacrificing for it. This is the spirit that's coming in this man. And he's not a fanatical radical. He's a very rational, determined, committed American. And so this summary view of the rights of British America was published and spread like wildfire all over England, all over the colonies, and Jefferson became famous, or infamous, as the case may be. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson became a household word in England, as well as America. And he's still a young fellow. Now, he said, this is so exciting and so important, I'm going to retire from the law. He'd been very successful in the law, made an average of around $3,000 a year, which in those days was a tremendous amount of money. It'd be like $150,000, $200,000 today. But he retired and turned the whole practice over to Edmund Randolph, his distant cousin, who later became governor and signed the Constitution later on. He was in the Constitutional Convention. Now, there were three different people that were writing various, what shall we say, summaries of the rights of Americans, things that we don't know anything about today. We haven't even been taught these fundamentals. I mean, it's kind of old-fashioned. We take it for granted. But I want to tell you, born of sweat, blood, and tears, the Albemarle resolutions were written up by Jefferson, setting forth very basic, beautiful principles that we're rapidly losing. The same thing was being done under the direction of George Washington and George Mason in the Fairfax counties, called the Fairfax Resolutions. In 1754, the very same thoughts had been written down by Franklin, all of them independently. But there was getting to be a consensus of understanding of rights, natural rights and prerogatives, and the essential elements necessary to build the first free people in modern times. It was bubbling up from somewhere, and several of them, including Jefferson, attributed it to inspiration and divine source. But they were all coming up with the same formula. Now, as he was sent to Congress, I ought to mention, Jefferson didn't give speeches. He had a very pleasant, soft, conversational voice. And just the moment that he began to express himself and strain in any way, he'd get hoarse in 3 minutes, till he could hardly talk. So he wouldn't give speeches. He wouldn't even read speeches. Once in a while he would speak. But he said, it isn't really important because everybody gives too long a speech anyway. And he said, all I have to say I can say in a few minutes. And he said, another writer says that he noticed that Franklin and Washington and Jefferson seldom, if ever, spoke more than 10 minutes, and usually said more than everybody else had said in many hours of debate. So anyway, that was Jefferson. Very quickly now, in March of 1776, now this is a great year, we've already gone past Lexington and Concord. We've had American blood spilt in this contest, as you remember, Bunker's Hill and so forth. We've had over 1,000 British killed after provoking fights in which about half as many Americans were killed. And the Americans said nobody had been killed if you hadn't provoked the fight at Bunker's Hill and at Lexington and at Concord. It's all your fault. So we did kill more of you, but it's your fault, you started it. You killed half of us, and we're upset about it. Anyway, all of that's in the mill already. And March 1776, Jefferson lost his mother. Now, it was only when his family revealed what it did to Jefferson that we realized how sensitive this man was concerning anybody that he really loved. He had several weeks of migraine headaches that were so terrible, he couldn't even talk to people. He was in such agony. And it only wore off gradually. Now, this is the spring of 1776. This is the man that's going to write the Declaration of Independence. And this is the state of mind he was in just a couple of months before he wrote it. He expressed himself to his friends and he said, we shouldn't really break away from England if we possibly can get our rights. But he said, if we're going to be imposed upon, as we have in the recent past, I will set my hand to sink the whole island. But he said, I love the British Empire. It's the most powerful nation in the world. I want to remain part of it if we can. But on June the 7th, Jefferson's fellow delegate, Richard Henry Lee, rose up in the Congress and said, I am authorized by the legislature of my state to move that this body declare these 13 colonies free and independent states, etc., etc., etc. Oh, things were really, this was electric. Many of the delegates said, oh, no, don't be so extreme. But the majority wanted to go for it. And they set up as July the 1st when they would vote on it. The others who were a little questioning said that they would contact their state legislatures for instruction. Meanwhile, they appointed a committee, you'll remember, to write a formal declaration. That always bothered me, why they even took the trouble to have a formal declaration. But in the opening paragraph, we have Thomas Jefferson saying why they wrote it. Do any of you remember why? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, do you remember how it was? They were actually going to outline how any other colony could break away either if they were abused. They were for dismantling the British Empire if the others wanted to go the way the Americans were going. That's why they were writing out the formula. And that's when Jefferson got the assignment, you'll remember, to write the draft, the main draft. He had originally recommended John Adams. And there sitting Franklin, one of the best writers that they had in the colonies. And Adams said, no, Thomas, you should write it. And Jefferson said, what are your reasons? And John Adams said, reason first, you are a Virginian. And a Virginian from the largest of the colonies ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. So Jefferson replied, if you are decided, I will do as well as I can. And that's from John Adams' record of what happened. So that's kind of interesting. So Jefferson worked on the draft 17 days, distilling what turns out to be about 2.5 printed pages now in our book. 17 days he worked on it. And he started out by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to preserve these rights, governments are established among men. Then he goes on to say that if the government that has been established to preserve those rights violates them, then the inalienable right of the people is to change it, overthrow it, or break away from it. And then they set forth a 29 long train of abuses of which King George was guilty. Jefferson, I'm sure, never suspected that 10 years from this moment, he will be standing in the presence of King George. And he shouldn't have been surprised the way he was treated. Anyway, and finally he ended it. Now listen to the way he ends it. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Jefferson and everybody that signed that declaration signed it in blood. Jefferson exhibited here that flame that had been struck in his heart by Patrick Henry was burning bright. He was willing to put his life on the line. So did every man who was there who signed it. Don't know how many Americans would dare do that today, but I think if we had an atomic bomb fall, everybody was alerted to it, and we had an invading force, either east or west, I think it'd be surprised how many Americans that you wouldn't think it as of this moment, and who wouldn't believe it themselves if you told them, would rise to the challenge, just as it did after Pearl Harbor. I've lived long enough to have seen it several times. So I don't lose faith in my fellow men, even though they seem kind of apathetic and indifferent sometimes. Well, the Declaration was adopted on July the 4th and signed by John Hancock. We don't know whether anybody else signed it or not, other than the one who attested to its authenticity, because the actual document that we have today was the embossed copy that was made real nice, and everybody signed it beginning on August the 2nd. That's the one we have. We don't know where the original one is. We don't even have it. But we have the one that was embossed and beautifully written up and signed on August the 2nd. Well, right after that, they appointed a committee. They thought they had to have a great seal, and that was interesting to me because the seal design was originally two Anglo-Saxon on one side named Hengist and Horsa, two brothers that brought the great institutes of liberty and freedom from the Anglo-Saxons into England in 450 AD. And they were identical with the ancient institutes of liberty given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Identical. So on the other side, they wanted to put the children of Israel going through the wilderness led by God's pillar of fire. Well, that was a little complicated to get on a little 2-inch medallion. So they ended up with a much simpler seal, which is the one that appears on our dollar, one side of our dollar bill. Now, very quickly, because the time is going rapidly, in September 1776, we were just about to go into the Battle of New York, and Washington said, I can't win this battle without a navy. All I can do is to just delay them and make a gesture of resistance to them so that they know we will fight, but eventually we will probably lose New York. And it was in that atmosphere, with the British beginning to move in and take New York, that Jefferson resigned from Congress. Shocking. Thomas, what are you doing? Resigning, going home. He said, we're going to win this war. And when we get our freedom and our independence, we won't know what to do with it. I'm going back to Virginia. We need at least one state to set itself up so that it can live under self-government and in a climate of freedom. Well, they said, yeah, we'll handle that when we come to it. No, he said, that'll be too late. And he made a prophecy of what would happen after the war was over. And everybody got disinterested and went their own way and treated every other colony or state like an enemy. That's exactly what happened. And Jefferson said, I got to go home. They hadn't let him participate in the creation of the Constitution for the state of Virginia, and as a result, it was very defective. And so he did the next best thing. He got himself elected into the House of Burgesses and from his county, and then he introduced bills to completely reform the entire criminal code. He got rid of the two worst things that perpetuated feudalism in the United States. First of all, primogeniture, which required a father to give his entire estate to his older son, no matter how unfit he might be. And the second one was estate's entail, which required that you give the whole estate. You can't divide it up with your children, you see. You have to always keep the land intact. That was part of the feudal obligation that went with the land. Virginia was the first to get rid of both of those laws. Now he said, we've got to start protecting people's rights, and so he revamped the entire criminal code, wrote most of it himself. Just fantastic what this man was capable of doing. And many of the freedoms we enjoy in America today is what Thomas Jefferson worked out during about 1.5 years during this reform program. While the Revolutionary War was grinding on, he made all of these improvements in government through Virginia, set an example, set a model. Well, the Virginia Constitution allowed a governor to be elected each year for 3 years and then no more. And Patrick Henry had been elected 3 times. And the 4th session, Jefferson was made the governor of Virginia. Now, as this was right in the middle of the war, and they'd had to flee from Williamsburg up to Richmond. And the next thing they knew, Cornwallis was moving in on Richmond, and he just had a desolation policy wherever he went. And so they finally moved clear out west to Charlottesville, near Monticello, the home of Jefferson. And the entire legislature stayed in Charlottesville, and Jefferson stayed in his home up on the mountain. And lo and behold, here came an army of a group of about 250 soldiers headed for Charlottesville and headed for Monticello to capture the entire legislature and especially Thomas Jefferson. And the man who brought them word of what was happening he rode all night long through brush and bushes and trees and his horse trying to find the way. His face was so lacerated by the branches and so forth that hit him in the face as he was going blindly through the darkness, that he carried those scars to his grave. And he came in all covered with blood to say, they're coming to capture all of you. And Jefferson only escaped by about 3 minutes as a result of that warning. Anyway, those were the days. I mean, they were rough, tough days. Now, after the Battle of Yorktown, it looked like the war perhaps was almost over. You couldn't tell. But in any way, it was kind of in that climate that the worst thing that could have happened to Jefferson happened to him. This was his worst year, 1782. The sweet wife of his had given birth to a little baby girl, Lucy Elizabeth, and couldn't recover. It's her 6th birth in 10 years. And she lingered 10 months and died in September of 1782. The reaction that it had on Jefferson was so overwhelming, they thought he'd lost his mind. He wouldn't come out of his room for nearly 3 weeks. They had to bring food to him. When he did come out, he wouldn't talk to anybody, and he would just go out and walk, or he'd get his horse and ride. And his oldest daughter was just young, I think 10 or 11, and she'd get on a horse and follow him to make sure he got home safely. And she described in her writings many of the things that he did. He was in a state of mental stupor, and it lasted for weeks and weeks. And finally he began to come to himself and realize that how terrible this was. But just think what happened to Jefferson. In 9 years, he lost his mother, his beloved mother, which left him an orphan without parents. He lost 4 of his 6 children, and he lost his wife. And all of a sudden, a sense of mission took over Jefferson that never left him, at least until he'd finished his 2nd term as president and went back to Monticello. A sense of mission so obsessed him that he became bold, he became aggressive, he began to write like he had never written before. It was just as though the divine providence, as he said, who giveth and who taketh away, has something for me to do. And I must make up for this terrible loss by doing something for my country that perhaps no one else is quite prepared to do. And that's how he really started out with vigor. He wrote his notes on Virginia, and that's the only full-length book that he ever wrote. But it's considered the finest scientific work to come out in the colonies as of that time. And it was a result of a French diplomat asking each of the governors of each of the states to tell us about your laws and the way you govern, and why have you been so successful? What's your success formula? Well, Jefferson took that seriously. You've got this magnificent statement of what they were trying to do in Virginia to make it a great free colony and state. And then, it wasn't very long after that he was sent over to France. He was going over to help write the peace treaty, but they wrote it too quickly, and so they didn't need him for that. Then they had to get trade with all the various countries in Europe, so he was sent over to negotiate these trade treaties with John Adams. And John Adams says, I tell you what, you come over in England and help me. And so they went over to England, and both of them were introduced to King George. And Jefferson said, it didn't take us long to find out what he thought of us. But all you got to do is go back in the Declaration of Independence and to see what Jefferson thought of King George to understand why the reception was a little cool. Well, while he was in France, he had a marvelous time. He loved the French people, but was just absolutely shocked with the way that the wealthy people treated the poor. Only 10% of the French people could read and write. And later on, as the French Revolution began to break out, he said, you are not prepared for self-government. You are not prepared. You must first get concessions from the king, just a little at a time. until you're able to gradually move over to at least a limited monarchy, something like England, and eventually you can have a constitution like the United States. Oh, they said, let's write one right now. We want you to write it. He said, I will not. I'm a delegate of the United States to the King of France. I'm not over here to write you a constitution. Well, he said, then we're going to go ahead and write it. And of course, all of you remember all the trouble and difficulties they had. Finally, after 5 years, he was able to get a leave of absence to go home. What he didn't know was that Washington now, the Constitution had been written, much of what he had recommended was in it. He had sent 200 books to Madison, and who'd done a cram session on it. And it was Madison who was really called the father of the Constitution based on the books that Jefferson wrote him, or sent to him. In any event, Washington had been elected president, and he has already decided that Jefferson will be his Secretary of State. So when Jefferson got home, he was shocked to be told he's Secretary of State. No, he said, I want to go back to Monticello. I want to rest. Well, they said, you can have a little rest, but then come back. When he went back to Monticello, something remarkable happened. He'd been away for 4 or 5 years about. And I have here a record by someone who was there who describes what happened. Folks up north would never believe this scene. The Negroes gathered about 4 miles from Monticello, waiting for the carriage to appear. When they discovered that it was approaching, such a scene I have never witnessed in my life. They collected in crowds around the carriage. They almost drew it up the mountain by hand. When the door of the carriage finally opened, they received him in their arms and bore him to the house, crowding around him, kissing his hands, some blubbering and crying, others laughing. It seemed impossible to satisfy their anxiety to touch and kiss him. His slaves, so-called. In the household of Thomas Jefferson, they were like members of his family. And he treated them accordingly. He tried to educate as many as who were interested. And he had problems. We have one that's kind of interesting that involves one of his young servants. He called them house servants. Anyway, he'd make nails. And one day, all the 8-penny nails disappeared from the nail shop. And finally, they were located, and it was found that this young fellow had done it. He'd stolen the nails, and they were so precious in those days. Boy, you could really bootleg them and get a lot of money out of nails. And so Thomas Jefferson asked that this young fellow be brought into him. And Captain Bacon, who was the overseer, said, I was expecting him to be sent back to me for a real good whipping. And pretty soon he came back and started to go to work again in the nail factory. And so Captain Bacon said, didn't Mr. Jefferson want you to have a whipping? And this fellow looked up and he says, no. We had a long talk. And he said, go and do it no more. I think I got religion. Anyway, the record says he didn't do it no more. And anyway, when Jefferson was there was no whipping of any of the slaves. And he was there for just a short time. And then, as you know, he went to be Secretary of State. Now, I have to summarize the remaining part of it very rapidly, but just enough to share with you some of these highlights. While he was Secretary of State, he established a policy of neutrality so that we didn't get involved with other nations. Unfortunately, those who followed him were not able to maintain that policy, and we got involved in all kinds of quarrels abroad. But he said, we will become prosperous and we will do well, we will have peace, and we don't start taking sides in Europe on who's right and who's wrong. Because usually both sides are at least partly wrong. But that neutrality policy didn't follow for too long a time. He did get us to abandon pounds and shillings and to adopt the dollar with the decimal system of dimes and so forth. All that was worked out by Jefferson. He also got us our our motto, "In God we trust," that some people have changed to "In gold we trust." And then he ran head on into Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, and the two of them just didn't jibe on hardly anything. Alexander Hamilton kept meddling in foreign affairs, which was over on Jefferson's side of the table. Jefferson had 5 employees. How do you like that? Isn't that a nice State Department? 5 employees. But Hamilton was a bureaucrat in his own mind. He had 70 employees for the Treasury. The private banks organize a fund and issue the currency in the name of the United States and become the official depository of the United States government and call it the United States Bank. Jefferson said, first of all, you don't have any authority to set up a United States Bank. Secondly, you're inviting another avalanche of paper money, and this will just line the pockets of the bankers with gold. This is evil. Everything about it's evil. It's not good for the banks. It's not good for the country. And so President Washington got ready to veto the bill after it had passed Congress. And then Hamilton got to him, and this is the old ploy. If you're elected to Congress, you have to get used to this. It's only a temporary program to get past the emergency. In 20 years, you see, we've limited the bank to 20 years. It's out after 20 years. We've paid our debts. We've regained our dignity in the world. Sign it. And the president did. Terrible mistake. We've never escaped from the mistake that Hamilton made in 1792. And in 1798, Hamilton said, I made a very serious error. A lot of people have never read that, but that's in Hamilton's writings. I made a mistake. The government should have issued the money based on gold, like the Constitution required. So anyway, we have Jefferson deciding to leave after the first administration of Washington, and he returned to his home at the end of 1793. Washington got him to stay a little bit of extra time, but then he returned to his home. And he had 3 beautiful years at Monticello. I have here Edmund Bacon's description of Jefferson during that period. Mr. Jefferson was like a fine horse. He had no surplus flesh. He had an iron constitution, was very strong. He was an early riser, rose at daybreak or before. He did not use tobacco in any form. He never used a profane word or anything like it. He never played cards. I never saw a card in the house at Monticello. Never ate much meat. He often told me as I was giving meat to our servants that what I gave them for a week would have lasted him 6 months. He's very fond of vegetables and fruits and raised a great variety of them himself. Every day he would have his horse brought out to take his ride. Usually about 9 o'clock. He was an uncommonly fine rider, sat easily upon the horse, and always had him in the most perfect control. And Mr. Jefferson was very liberal and kind to the poor. People all about the country would come in crowds to Monticello to beg. He would give them notes to me, directing me what I should give them, and I could hardly get it hauled out as fast as he'd give it away. Then one of his house servants, an African-American, whose name was Isaac, was asked years afterwards his memory of Master Jefferson. He said the old master had abundance of books. Sometimes he'd have 20 of them down on the floor all at once. Read first one, then another. And I often wondered how old master come to have such a mighty head, read so many of them books. And when they go to him to ask him anything, he'd go right straight to the book, and he'd tell them all about it. He kept 3 fiddles, played in the afternoon, sometimes after supper. Mr. Jefferson always singing when riding or walking. Hardly see him anywhere outdoors but what he's a-singing. Had a fine, clear voice. He was very kind to his servants. Kind of interesting. Well, just let me remind you now that while he was there at home, hadn't run for office or anything else, he suddenly finds that he almost was elected president to follow George Washington. John Adams beat him out by just a little bit, and the law then was that whoever was number one in the electoral vote got to be president, number two got to be vice president. Oh, I got to leave Monticello. They went and elected me vice president. He just felt like that was a dirty trade. Anyway, they had moved now from New York. Well, at first they were in New York, and when he got there, he was most unhappy. The Federalist Party was copying all of the pageantry of the royal programs of the British, and he just despised that. He said, "You're losing your principle. You're getting us into a class structure again." He said, "Didn't we learn anything during these years?" Anyway, he was quite unhappy. But he served as vice president, and he watched several things happen that he felt were very evil and that would have to be corrected. And so in 1800, he agreed that he would run for president. And interestingly enough, his appeal to the people was so popular that the Federalists were thrown out of power, not by too big a margin, but the what we call the Republicans, he called his party the Democratic Republicans. You can't beat that, if you're a politician. Anyway, the Democratic Republicans, they have the majority. So when the electors start casting their ballots, they naturally vote for two. You vote for a president and a vice president. Then they count up and see who got the most, and that's president, the next one, vice president. There's a tie. The law then said it has to go to the House of Representatives, and where the majority of them were now Jefferson's party, and they all vote for two. They voted 36 times, and they can't break the tie. Nobody knows whether it's going to be Jefferson or this Aaron Burr, of all people. And everybody thought they were voting for Aaron Burr for vice president, but they keep coming out a tie. And finally, it was a member of the Federalist Party that came over and said, "We can't stand Aaron Burr," and he cast his vote in such a way that it gave Jefferson one vote. And Jefferson went in as president and Aaron Burr as vice president. The first 2 years of Jefferson's administration were very tranquil, very quiet. And if you want to really read what America should be like today, you read the first inaugural address that Jefferson gave. When he was inaugurated, John Adams wouldn't even stay, didn't even go to the inaugural. He said, "There's going to be revolution now. We'll have nothing but riots as these common people take over." He didn't have any confidence in the common people. So he just got in a carriage and took off. He didn't even stay for the inaugural. But there weren't riots. And in the inaugural address, it's beautiful. Jefferson says, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to reduce taxes. We're going to reduce the number of employees in governments. We're going to reduce the size of the army. We're going to eliminate all of these extra taxes that have been put on you." And they did. They did. I want to tell you, the second go-round, he was very popular and went into his second term with such an overwhelming vote that the Federalist Party never recovered and finally just disappeared from the face of the map. Now, something terrible happened during his second 2 years. There was a man by the name of Callender who wanted to be postmaster in Richmond. And Callender didn't get the job because Jefferson did not believe in patronage. He gave jobs to people that were competent. And he'd even appoint Federalists if they were more competent than someone else. It was very interesting how he did that. But anyway, Callender was so angry with him that he went over and joined the staff of a Federalist paper and told him he had some good secrets on the private life of Jefferson that would just blow him out of the water. And so he began printing the most vicious kind of slander against Thomas Jefferson. Said that he had several children by a woman named Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, one of his household servants. And she did have several half-white children. He named them. The names didn't turn out to be the right names. I mean, it didn't take much research to show that it was an absolute fake. Everybody who was in the family, who lived with Jefferson, knew that he'd been circumspect in his moral life. Some would have called him prudish. But his love for his sweetheart, who had died a few years earlier, was his companionship and comfort through the rest of his life. Anyway, these slanders were so terrible and they were so widespread and so widely believed, he was fearful that when the election came up it would not be possible to overcome the slander, and he would not answer them. He said, that's not my policy. I do not respond to these. I just hope that people have sense enough to realize the origin of them. Anyway, he didn't answer them. And he was vindicated. The people put him in office with an overwhelming support. And do you know what's happened? Just recently, all of those slanders have been revived. And the documentation is what Callender said had happened. And years ago it was proven who was the father of this Hemmings girl's children. That's all been documented. And Fawn Brodie came out with her book called Thomas Jefferson, His Intimate Life, I think it was. His intimate... An intimate history? Yeah, an intimate history. And regurgitated all of this phony, false material. And in your book, what the historians say about that is all recorded. Andrew Allison has done a marvelous job addressing all of these problems connected with Jefferson. And the real life of Thomas Jefferson comes shining through. You're going to really enjoy that book. And in his second administration, you remember, he was able to catalog some of the accomplishments that had occurred, which I'll just refer to very briefly here. He had launched the Lewis and Clark expedition into the Northwest. He wanted the United States to go to the Pacific coast. He had overcome the Barbary pirates who, after the United States had paid over $2 million in tribute to those pirates. They were Mohammedans that occupied 4 countries there in North Africa. If you had an American ship out there, they'd go out and say, we'll sink you, we'll burn you if you don't pay tribute. And our country paid a tremendous amount of tribute over a period of about 15 years. Finally, Jefferson said, now that I'm president, we pay no more tribute. And he sent warships in there, and they settled it not only for the United States, but for all countries. Never again would they try to get tribute from any of the vessels traveling on the open Mediterranean. And then he was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the land of the United States. Just doubled the amount of territory that was in the United States. Now, after he had finished his second term, he retired from Washington. And it's most interesting. His successor was named James Madison, very close friend, compatriot in writing laws and so forth down through the years. They were virtual neighbors in Virginia. Do you know that Jefferson wouldn't ride in the carriage with Madison? He insisted on walking with the crowd. He said, no, I've returned to the people. I'm just part of the people now. The glory and honor must all be his. I don't want to be there to detract. I'm just going to walk along with the people. And when he got to the Capitol building, they had a seat there for him. Oh, no. He said, I don't belong up there. No, I'm just the people. I'm just down here enjoying being the people. And afterwards, he packed up his suitcase and he left Washington, and he never returned in his entire lifetime. He went back to Monticello and lived the richness of his life with his several grandchildren. He only had 2 daughters left, and one of them died in childbirth. But he raised the grandchildren himself, and Martha was there with her husband, her grandchildren. And our book ends describing his latter years. Magnificent. And he had a routine. He rode his horse. And then he had a certain time when he'd have races with the children. He'd get in the front room and he'd fiddle. And he'd dance. And he'd jump around. Here's a man you see getting close to 80. And just having a wonderful time with his grandchildren. And I identify with him just a little now that we've got up to number 40 here. And there's joy in your posterity. There's just no doubt about it. That's the richest treasure of life. And that's what Jefferson called his sweet grandchildren. Robbed nearly all of his own family, including his mother and his wife. In this second generation, he rejoiced. Martha, his oldest daughter, is the only one that survived him. Of his 6 children, Martha was the only one, Mary having died in childbirth earlier. And finally, he and John Adams got into some close correspondence. Those letters are so beautiful as these two old men commiserate with each other, apologize to each other, express love for each other, and they tried to do what they could to be an influence for good. Jefferson on the Monroe Doctrine and John Adams on some other things that needed to be done. But they realized it was up to another generation to carry on. And so, as July the 4th, 1826 approached, John Adams was very ill, and Thomas Jefferson was sinking into a coma. All the family hoped that they would each survive until the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson almost went the night before, and they were so relieved when his breath suddenly came back and he opened his eyes and said, "Is it July the 4th yet?" And they said no, and he shut his eyes and went back to sleep. And it wasn't until noon the next day that he passed away. John Adams, meanwhile, didn't just fade with debilitation like Jefferson did. He really suffered as he reached toward the end, and had been in considerable agony and pain, but was lucid much of the time. And in the afternoon of July the 4th, they could all see that the end was near. And the last thing he said, "Thank God Jefferson still survives." But Jefferson had preceded him into the spirit world and probably welcomed him as he came across 4 hours later. And so those two great scholars, and we'll tell you John Adams' whole story one day, those two great men went on July the 4th, 1826. Now, the last part of the book that's been prepared for you are the writings of Thomas Jefferson on almost every subject that you could imagine. You can look them up. You'll find it exciting to see what Jefferson had to say about John Adams. There's a whole page or so there of various quotations from him. Also, what he had to say about Sam Adams, whom Jefferson called his patriarch of political philosophy. And then you'll get over to what he had to say about alcohol, what he had to say about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the passages on America that are inspirational. You could read them in any patriotic talk or even sermon. And then you get over to capital punishment, his attitude toward capital punishment. What did he have to say about that and why? And you get over to Christianity. Most interesting, his attitude toward Christianity. I was told in school that he was a deist, which meant that he thought there was a great teleological force out there, but not a personal God, not anybody you could pray to. Why, Jefferson, while he was governor, ordered days of fasting and prayer to petition God that he would help the people during the Revolution. And Washington, on 67 occasions, wrote to Congress and said, "You see, had not the intervention of God been present, we would have lost this particular encounter." These men had a personal God. He helped design one of the churches in Charlottesville, contributed $200 to another one of a different faith. He was very critical of some of the mainstream churches because of the way they'd let ritual and even some of their doctrine corrupt the real teachings of Jesus. But he put all of the teachings of Jesus in Latin and in Greek and German and French. And he put them all in a row. It's called Jefferson's Bible. And it's just the sayings of Jesus. And anything but the sayings of Jesus, called Jefferson's Bible. And everybody said, "You see, he's an atheist. He just took out certain parts of the Bible." No, notice what he has to say about Christianity. Here was a very religious man, and he wouldn't let anybody ask him about his religion or his faith because he really felt very critical of what some of the churches were doing, but he didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But he felt they could teach and practice Christianity better than some of the mainstream churches were doing. Anyway, that's the last half of your book on almost any topic you want to look up. So I close. I've been very patient in this rather long review of Jefferson, but I've only given you about 1/100 of what's in the book. When you get through reading this book, you probably will have the same reaction that I had. I just thank God there was a Thomas Jefferson. And as I look about me today and see the problems that plague our nation, there isn't a single one that Jefferson didn't address and give proper solutions for. Studying this book at least once a year can be very profitable reading because it applies to our time. This is not ancient history. This is almost current history. And the great man that was behind it is turning out to be a real hero and not the scarred personality that Fawn Brodie and others would like to have made him. She was one of the historians that was called a debunker, who prided themselves in doing what she said made the founders human beings. Well, they were human beings. They weren't plaster saints. And what problems they had, they're human. But when they make up lies about them, just to destroy our confidence in them and their teachings, that's a genuine intellectual fraud. And so we owe it to our children, we owe it to our schools, we owe it to our people to know Thomas Jefferson, the real Thomas Jefferson that Andy Allison was able to capture in this book. And so I say, God bless the memory of Thomas Jefferson. And I just hope that this generation eventually can be worthy of his teachings and his examples and revive them in order to save the Constitution and restore the true dignity and greatness of the United States. Thanks.